Okay, in today's session, we are going to be attempting to cover the topic of does a person personally need to count the sefira sa'omer, or could he fulfill his obligation by listening to someone else count, such as the chazan? There are really two different aspects about this topic. Firstly, we have the beracha on sefira, okay, the beracha itself. Could you fulfill your obligation by listening to someone else? And secondly, we have the actual counting itself. Okay? So, could both be done by listening to someone else, or do you need to personally do it? And why would sefira be any different? That's the main topic that we need to discuss. If time allows, we will additionally, towards the end, delve into the concept of is it better to do sefira and count with more people? Is there a concept of having a minion when you do sefira, 10 people? And why? So we're going to have to exactly go into that, some sources for that. Let's start straight with the Mishna Berura that we already learned together quickly. Beginning of some tough pay tests, the Mishna Berura and Oz Hay is commenting on the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, umitzvah al kol echad lispor ba'atzma. Which means, simple explanation, there's a mitzvah for everyone to count personally by himself. Source of this, of course, is the Gemara in Maseches Menachos, Samachayim and Beis. Those are the main sources for all of the halachas that we're learning, as we already learned some of those Gemaras in Samachay, Samachav. The Mishna Berura comments on this and says, Lispor latzma is a mitzvah to count yourself. Tichsiv, as the pasuk states, Usvartem lachem, that you shall count yourself. In other words, there's a mitzvah to personally count because the pasuk says you shall count. Mashma sheha mitzvah chal al kol yachid v'yachid. It's implied that this mitzvah of counting sefira falls on each individual. It's an individual obligation. Those Vahadar Mishna Berura explains the explanation of this Mishna Berura is the obligation to count sefira is placed on each individual, and even though that all mitzvahs of the Torah are really placed on the individual, nevertheless, there are two different types of mitzvahs. And the Mishna Berura continues and explains, V'hine mashma mizeh, the besfira eino kemoi b'shar mitzvahs hatulu b'amir le'inyin kiddush v'avdil v'kiyotz. That's implied from this that sefira is not like other mitzvahs that are dependent upon speech. For example, Kiddush and Avdallah and the like. Tim Shama lechaveiro even is kavein lotzes the yoytzi bazim mishum d'shmei kaina. Typically, we say regarding other mitzvahs, the person heard from his friend. Tim Shama lechaveiro, you heard your friend utter something. Even is kavein lotzes, and you had in mind to fulfill your obligation with your friend's recitation. The yoytzi bazeh that you would in fact fulfill your obligation with that. Mishum d'shemei ka'ina. Why? Because listening is like answering. So when you listen to someone else say something, it's considered as if you yourself said it. This is typically done on Kiddush on Shabbos. It's done in other places, also Havdalah a lot of times. And that's actually the examples that the Mishna Berura himself gives. So there's a general concept that Shemei Ka'ona works. But over here the Torah reveals to us, you would not fulfill your obligation as long as you didn't personally count. In other words, simple explanation of this pasuk, usfartem lachem, that you shall count, refers to one personally needs to count, and sefira is an exception and is unlike all other mitzvahs. For example, we have one Baal Koyer, someone lanes, he reads the Megillah for everyone listens and fulfill their obligation. That works by other mitzvahs, Kiddush, Avdallah, etc. But over here, since the pasuk says, Lachem, keyword, the pasuk says, Usfartem lachem, you shall count. That implies that everyone has to personally count. And as long as you didn't personally count, even if you answered Amen to someone who said the beracha and counted, you would not fulfill your obligation according to this understanding. But wait, don't go. Because it is not so simple that we're going to hold this way at the end of the day. But before we get to the conclusion over here, this is similar to what the Gemara in Sukkah Mem Gimel teaches us. Lakachtem lachem, same word lachem, you shall take the lulav, esrog, hadassim, aravas. You shall take the daled minim. Everyone has to personally take them. Now, what's the obvious difference between the mitzvah of sefira and lulav and daled minim? Why could one easily debunk this proof? Exactly. The mitzvah of daled minim is a mitzvah shebegufa. It's a mitzvah that one personally, physically needs to perform. He needs to physically perform with his own body, as opposed to sefira. Yes, it's physical because you're moving your lips, but at the end of the day, it's verbal. Mishna Berura continues and says, Aval. What does aval mean?
What? However,
What does it really mean?
we're going the other way.
I'm paskening.
No, okay.
Mishna Berura says, I don't go that way. I'm not ruling that way. Aval, but Yesh ma'achronim shekosvu. Some achronim write, the kavanas ha'Torah hu rak de lo yinema de mitzvah zoha bezdin levad. The intention of the Torah is that one shouldn't say that this mitzvah goes on bezdin. Which means, when the Torah said, usfartan lachem, that you shall count, what the Torah meant is that don't say that this mitzvah has to be done, has to be performed by bezdin, by the Jewish court. Like by Shemitah and Yovel, as it says over there, that you shall count.
Why is there
In other words,
singular in here?
Oh, okay. So we're gonna have to have a brief conversation about that.
I guess I'll shuffle them.
Okay. So over there, we're saying no. The Torah is not coming to exclude and say that you would not fulfill your obligation by listening to someone else. You shouldn't say that this mitzvah is on Bezdin, meaning don't say that Bezdin is the only one who has to count the 7 weeks, like Shemitah and Yovel. By Shemitah and Yovel, every 7 years, 49 years, Bezdin counts. They count the year at that time over there, right? So don't say that it's an obligation, that everyone is obligated to count 49 years in order to know when the Yovel falls out. No. Right? Alakaya tzibur. Rather, this goes on the entire congregation. Meaning that the Beis Din counts on behalf of all the Jews. That's what the Torah says, lachem. Individually.
And would you think the other way around? It's counterintuitive.
You would. They discussed that. The Taisus Menach Samachay isn't sure if Beis Din would count with the beracha or not. Something to talk about. Mishna Berura continues and says, Aval. But the truth of the matter is, if you heard your friend count sefira, and you had in mind to fulfill your obligation, and also your friend had in mind to cause you to fulfill your obligation, two-way street, like in all places that we hold Shemei Ka'ina, then it will work. Yatsa. And you will fulfill your obligation with that, just like we hold in any single place that listening is like answering. It comes out that the Mishna Berura, at the end of the day, we're going to see all the sources in the beracha, is that you would fulfill your obligation of sefira by listening to someone else. The calls of sefira, says the Mishna Berura, all this is referring to the actual counting itself. Aval, however, when it comes to the beracha that we say before we count sefira, So everyone agrees that it's possible to fulfill your obligation by listening to your friend, even if you're an expert, just like on all brachos. So for sure it would work. In other words, we see over here that the Mishna Berura himself is distinguishing between the actual counting versus the beracha. You could be more lenient on the beracha than the actual counting, but even on the counting, technically from the letter of the law, you can fulfill your obligation by listening to someone else count. Then comes the Mishna Berura on the next step. Actually, before we go to the next step, let's just slow it down a little bit over here. Chaf Dalet and Chaf Hey. Okay, we don't need to see that over there. Okay, so let's see the next page over here. Okay, see where this continues. Oh, here. Okay, let's finish this Mishnah Berura. I don't think they have anything else on the Mishnah Berura that they comment on. Mishna Berura continues and says, "Miu minimum kol yizos shekol echad mevarach v'soif alatzmo." The custom of all Jews is that everyone should say the bracha and count himself. Everyone should say the bracha and count. Ve'ein soimchin ala shliach tzibur, and you don't rely on the chazan. Okay, so the custom among all Jews is for everyone to count, make the bracha and count, and not to rely on the chazan. So even though that it would work, still we don't do such a thing. Everyone personally counts, even though technically it would work. Shemekon. Then the Mishnah Berura discusses something else about counting in different languages. Okay. The Chafetz Chaim down here in the Shara Tzion points something out very important. When we call Makom Pasha, the im yeshlo safek be'eze inyan. Let's say you're a doubt, you're not sure if you missed a day or not, or you were knocked out of the sefira. So the halacha is, we'll have to learn later in the siman, is that you count and you continue counting without a bracha. You're supposed to count every single day, even though you lost the bracha. But let's say you're not sure if you said the right night, one of the nights. So therefore, you're not sure if you should still count with the bracha or not. So very simple. If you have a doubt, you need to count without a bracha still. However, if you're able to hear the bracha from others, so then you should do that. And you should have in mind that you are going to fulfill your obligation with this bracha if you are in fact obligated. This is certainly correct to do. In other words, if you have a doubt, if you are supposed to say a bracha or not, the halacha is safek brachos lahakil. You should be lenient on the a bracha that you have and not say it. However, you have nothing to lose by listening to the chazan say the bracha. You should have it in mind to fulfill your obligation with that chazan.
You're assuming that the chazan has you in mind. I mean, that's just a
Correct. After all, the chazan is called shliach tzibur, messenger of the congregation. He is up there to help others. That's a discussion in of itself, much more of a discussion than what we just discussed. But so this is the Mishna Berura. This is how he rules at the end of the day. The Halacha elaborates on this in Dibur Maskul Mitzvah. I'm a Mishna Berura shekasavti machlokas achroinim imamrinam bazeh shemei koinim. Says, look at the Mishna Berura, where I wrote an argument among the achroinim If we say Shemea Kain over here, do we say that listening is like answering? We discussed that. V'uma chloikis alavush v'achloik Yaakov ima pri chadash. This is machlokes achronim between the Lavush and Chok Yaakov arguing on the Pri Chadash. The Lavush v'Chok Yaakov kemoy del inyan lulav darshin and ulakachta machem v'kol echad ve'echad kemoy kein hacha sada kol echad ve'echad ba'atzma lispa. We have the Lavush and the Chok Yaakov. They compare Sefira to the Daled Minim to Lulav, and they say, just like by Daled Minim, it says lakachtem lachem. You have to personally take it. It's a mitzvah shebagufo. You have to do it with your body. Shal gufo, whole ksais over there. You have to personally do it. Kemoy kein hacha, so too over here. Sadakol echa ve'echa ba'atzma lispor. You yourself have to count. That's according to the Lavosh and the L'chalik Yaakov. The pre-Chodesh is lenient with this, and that's also what the Birchei Yosef holds. You could be lenient. What's the idea that everyone needs to personally count? Okay, so that's the difference. Now, to defend this opinion of the pre-Chodesh and the Birchei Yosef, who the Mishna Berura was lenient in his conclusion, they would say the difference between a physical mitzvah, the mitzvah that has a ma'aser, talui b'ma'aser, versus a mitzvah that's talui b'dibur. By Daled Minim, it's a physical act, unlike sefira, where it's verbal. Some have a sefira opinion that when they're doing halacha, you don't talk about anything else. Stick to halacha. Is that my custom? We could learn from this idea of a mitzvah shal gufo. Sometimes people think, money solves all issues. It solves a lot of issues, let's be honest. But it could also create a lot of issues, and it can't solve everything. One of the things, let's say someone hires me, and they're paying me to teach them. Okay, very good. Does that become now that they automatically gain all of the Torah knowledge that I have? No. Certain things, it's a mitzvah sha'al gufa. You have to do it yourself. You got to sit in the base medrash and be amel b'Torah. People nowadays, they want instant everything. They call it instant coffee, right? There's no such thing as instant Talmud Chacham. Person's got to sit and he's got to learn and he's got to spend time on it. Spend a lot of time. I just read this morning at 5:32 a.m. Rav Zilberstein is Alein Shabbat has around 30 pages on the Meilus B'Torah, and within there he quotes this, and he says that what does that mean? Simple explanation is that you got to crush yourself over it. You've got to kill yourself. You've got to forget about all of the other pleasures of this world, all the other stuff that people run after. Just sit and learn Torah Kedoshah. Simple explanation. But it's learned out from an oil, a tent. What's a tent? You got to lock yourself out of the world. Put yourself in the tent, away from everything else. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. Put yourself in your own tent. And only if a person is going to dedicate large chunks of time, specifically for Torah, will he actually get somewhere? Will he become something? We'll talk about it when we do the official parsha, of course. We got double this week, Baruch Hu calls double trouble. So we're going to have to see what's going to happen. We got to also finish this first sip before we get out of sefira. We're already on Lag BaOmer over here. We're still in the first sip. We got trouble. But we're going to be turning over the page of Mishna Berura now. So that's a big thing with the beracha. So we moved somewhere. We did our Amud. But anyways, that's what this reminds me of. You got to do it yourself. Person's got to sit. He's got to review. He's got to keep. Lanias Daiti says the beracha. Davar ze plugaso bein rishonim. Says the beracha. This is an argument among the rishonim. So it's not so simple. In other words, don't think that this important subject is just an argument among the Achronim, Machlokes Achronim, among the rabbis from around 400 or 500 years ago. No, it goes back 1,000 years, this argument. The Rashi Peter Sham b'Menachos, Rashi in Menachos on Samachim at Beis explains Hamatika Amar Sham b'Gemara. The Gemara says Kol Echad ve'Echad shekol Echad Chayiv Lispor. Everyone has to personally count Sefira. That's what Rashi says on Menachos. Ubir b'Chedushi Harash b'Devorov. And the Rashba explains Rashi, De'i Kavanas HaTorah L'Tzibur Lavad. If the Torah intended that specifically the congregation itself would count Sefira, ve'lo l'kol yochid v'yochid, and not every single individual, then the Torah should have just said, count, in the plural tense. Right, and remain silent. And here we got a little lachem discussion. And from the fact that the Torah says lachem, continuing the beracha on the next page, it's implied that everyone has to personally count the sefira. That's what lachem teaches. So we see that there is an independent, that this mitzvah is applicable on each individual independently to count. In other words, Rashi is bothered by, where do you see in this pasuk that there's an obligation for everyone to individually count? On the contrary, since the Torah said lachem in the plural tense and not in the singular tense, lacha, for you see that the Torah says, oh, it's communal or it's on bedieved, that there are a lot of people, but not for each individual. Comes the Rashba and answers, no, the Torah then just would have said usfartim. Because Sfartim is the plural tense, Lashon Rabin, which would imply that the obligation is placed on the congregation, not the individual. From the fact that it says lachem, that implies that it is in fact a individual argument. I should just point out over here, if you want some dessert later on, there's actually a major discussion what the Rashba himself holds, and they really present a very nice details about this. They give a nice presentation down here of what does the Rashba himself hold. Who does he really hold like? In terms of an individual or communal, but why does it say lachem? For each individual? For each individual. That was the hard part. You got that, you got everything today. Comes the beracha in the continuation. However, on the other side, Meloshen hakadmo and haritz geius, mashma she'echad yochel lohoitzias chaveiro bazeh. In other words, simple understanding, the way that the Chafetz Chaim and the beracha is understanding this Rashba is that it's an individual mitzvah, and you cannot fulfill your obligation by listening to someone else count. Okay? However, the Ritz Gaius says it's implied she'echad yochel lohoitzias chaveiro bazeh. The Ritz Gaius argues that not one person could fulfill the obligation of his friend. His friend could listen and fulfill his obligation. He argues, this is what he says. Sham behelchos sefira. Over there in the halachas of sefira sa'imir. V'anu kach kibalni b'rabbanoseinu asmachta l'sefira sa'imir ba'amida. That we have a tradition from our rabbis, a basis for counting sefira standing. Tradition we have. Midichtiv, because the pasuk says, Mehachel chermash bakama. Mehachel means from when you begin. Chermash means the sickle, or it's referring to the act of cutting. Bakama is the standing stalk. Shein tamalom bakama. Don't read the pasuk that it means standing stalk. Rather, this is teaching that we need to stand when we say sefira. All mitzvahs, by the way, I learned from sure that you need to stand by all mitzvahs. Incredible how much is going on in sefira. We're learning all mitzvahs that you need to stand from it. Ubemoitze Shabbos, furthermore, says the Ritzkeis, after Shabbos, Sha'omrim al-acher tefilus arvis, we say after Mar, Vahinoim kedusha desidr k'shehim yoishvin. We say after Marav Ahinoim and Kedusha Desidru, we say Uval Etzion when they are sitting. Nahagu Rishonim Avarach Sheyachsim Uma. The custom is for the chazan to stand. V'kol hakal onim amin b'kavana, and everyone answers amen with intent. Shaloi lahatriach hatzibur, with intending to fulfill their obligation. Shalatriach hatzibur lachs v'lamot, not to burden the congregation to return and stand. That requires a lot of explanation of itself. First of all, why does he say that we sit when we do Uval Etzion? If we go back to what we learned in Hilchos Havdalah together in Siman Reish Sad Yehei, Sifkat and Aleph in the Mishna Berura, the pasuk of Vayi Noam and Uval Etzion, it should all be done standing. Okay, so this is a major discussion. What he says sitting.
Vayi Noam and Voltzion, or just says Vayi Noam?
Vayi Noam and Kedusha Desidra.
He says sitting.
He says sitting, but the halacha is like we learned over there standing. Right? So this already requires discussion. Is he Sephardi? Is he not? Is there a difference? There's what to look into from a halachic and historical perspective on this nuance of this beracha. Furthermore, it says that everyone answers Amen, right? The custom is that the chazan stands and everyone answers Amen, not to burden the congregation to return and stand up. But you're supposed to count sefira standing anyway, so who cares about the bracha? So there's what to look into over here, but nevertheless, the point of why this is being quoted by the beracha is to show that the Ritz Gaius clearly holds that it's not an individual obligation, and one can fulfill his obligation by listening to others. V'chein kosav Baal Orchos Chaim, that's what the Orchos Chaim writes as well. B'shem Rav Haigon and Sham in the name of Rav Haigon. So it's implied from this that you can fulfill your obligation with the counting. Because if you want to only say that you're going to fulfill your obligation with just listening to the bracha, and if that would be so, then you need to stand for the actual sefira gufa, the sefira itself, that you need to stand with, like we mentioned above. In other words, you need to stand for the actual sefira itself. You see from this that you could fulfill your obligation with someone else. What do they say over here? Mira, the Rishonim learn that from Lachem you need to stand. Okay, we'll come back to Mem Dalet in a moment. If the explanation is that you would not fulfill that you would only fulfill your obligation with the bracha before sefira, which needs to be standing, not the sefira itself. So in the congregation, we need to stand for sefira itself. How would it help that the Chachamim enacted that you fulfill your obligation from the chazan in order not to burden them to stand? In the end, you're going to need to stand anyways. That's the Orchos Chaim writes, B'Shem Rav Haigon, quoting Rav Hai in Sham. See over there, Mashmud said Yotzim B'Tzivos. Okay, so we just saw Lanias Daiti, Yeshayin Afilu Pei Rashash Yan Nizkar Le'el, Heichashin Abaki Lisbar Ba'atzmo. Okay, this is a new point. Okay, so now, before we continue with this beracha, they point out in the footnote that this drasha of Al Tikri B'Kama Ela B'Koyma, you should do a standing, is not in the Gemara, in the Yerushalmi, or the Bavli. Okay? There's a Midrash Tanoim. This is just going through the source of why you need to stand for mitzvahs. It's a pretty important footnote, if you ask me. It's in the Midrash Tanoim, it's in the Psikta Zutrasa, it's in the Vayikra Rabbah. The Rosh already quotes this and says, "V'chim avarchim avarchim u'umad." You say the bracha standing, the Tanur Rabbanan, because the Brisa says Bakama, etc., with the whole drasha. Oh, from the fact that you see it's Tanur Rabbanan, it's implied that he saw it in a Brisa. The Rosh saw it in a Brisa. Comes the Shal Zechuvas Chaim Shal and Chilik Beis and Alf and says no, it's not a Brisa. So when it says the Tanur Rabbanan, it's not from the Rosh. Those are people who edited the Rosh and they didn't know the proper translation and the proper explanation of this. Yeah. The Nemuki Hagrib on the Rosh comments that that the Rosh really said the Samchuhu Rabbanan. The rabbis based this on. But they thought that it was the letters Dalet Samach Reish, which was Desamchu Rabbanan, but the editor changed it. He didn't know that abbreviation, Desamchu Rabbanan. He changed it to Dalet Taf Reish. He swapped the Samach out and he put the Taf in to spell Detan Rabbanan. But it's not a Braisa. Many Rishonim mention this. For example, the Machzor Taner Rabasi, the Shibali Aleket, the Kolbo of Rajamin Mor Rabinu Peritzin is goes to the Smach, writes this, quoting the Rambam. The Rambam in front of us says that you need to stand, but he does not mention this drush of Bekama. And this is specifically said by mitzvahs wherever it says lachem, such as sefira, oimer, sitzes, lulav. You got to stand for all of those. The Torah says also shofar yom shu lachem. It says lachem for you. Other Rishonim find that even on Kiddush Lavana it says achodesh lachem by milahimu lachem. For all of these you need to stand because it keeps saying lachem. It's all derived from sefira. However, it's not a full-fledged drasha, and therefore, if someone counted bedieved, like we learned in this Mishna Berura, he would in fact fulfill his obligation post facto if he counted sitting, because it's not a full-fledged drasha. That's a practical ramification based on how authentic this drasha really is, so to say. The Shulchan Aruch Harav writes in Siv Dalet, nevertheless, if you counted sitting, you fulfill your obligation, because this is only based on the pasuk. It's not a full-fledged drasha. The Shiboli Halekes in Marish Dalet says that the Sefira Somer is connected to ksira, to cutting, and just like when you cut the wheat, it needs to be done standing for the Korban Omer, so too when you count. Another interesting connection over there, concluding with the Ber Halacha. In parentheses, the Ber Halacha writes, according to my opinion, let's say you're not an expert counting yourself. So regarding your friend fulfilling your obligation, so regarding by benching, one friend cannot fulfill his obligations, friend, and another person will listen to him bench if he's an expert and knows how to do it himself. Right? Unless it's your friend 8, then it could work. Even so we hold. However, if you have someone who is illiterate, so then someone else could bench for him, even if that person didn't eat. The person who's actually benching, another person could fulfill his obligation. Same could apply over here. If someone doesn't know how to count, perhaps he could fulfill his obligation. It's more of a halachic reasoning, at least according to Rashi, even according to Rashi, that he could fulfill his obligation with the person counting. The Sadach Ian, but this in fact requires more research. This specific nekuda, this nuance over here that the beracha is discussing at the end. The beracha concludes by saying, Hari, Beranu Dedavar Plugasa Deravasa, who we explained that this is in fact an argument among not just the Achronim, but the Rishonim. And therefore, preferably, a person should personally count. Preferably, everyone should count, concludes the beracha. However, post facto, if someone heard from his friend, count the sefira and had in mind to fulfill his obligation, he would fulfill his obligation. However, he should still count again without a bracha. It's interesting. So even though he himself didn't say the bracha, he listened to someone else say the bracha and someone else count. He filled the obligation with the person's counting and bracha. Still, you should count again, just to cover all bases that you should personally count. So that is basically the conclusion of personally counting versus someone else without anything fancy, just learning the Mishna Berura and the Ber Halacha as best as we could. I think there were a couple of points in the Ber Halacha that should be relearned again a little slower, that were a little complex, but that's a simple explanation, and we ran out of time to cover today the topic of counting sefira with more people. Is it better or not? Do you need a minyan? Which kind of ties into this because it has to do with personally versus other people. So we'll do that in the upcoming sessions that we have. So this is basically the Ber Halacha, and we are more than halfway done with this sif, which is more than probably a quarter of all the halachas of Sefira Omer. Truth is, if you break it down like that. Okay, everyone have a wonderful day.
Sure.
So technically one should, I mean, you don't have to have it, but it's understood that when he was making the broad counting, you're not being yotzei with that. Stuff like
Right. We're going to learn about having a negative kavana and why it is that people don't say beracha beracha shema. We also didn't cover that because
why
we
should or shouldn't.
Why they shouldn't. Because if you're not fulfilling your obligation and people are just listening to the chazan, but maybe they're going to fulfill their obligation if they don't have any intention. Stam kavanakum is kavindam.
That would negate it.
Right. So we have to have that discussion. We didn't have time for it today, but that's another topic that ties directly into this topic. By the way, yesterday, what topic did we cover again yesterday?
yesterday.
That was the Aleinu,
Oh,
right?
wait, yeah, the whole thing with the
Okay,
Aleinu.
one important point you left earlier. I forgot to say it before, and I told David. I remembered it after when we were talking more about it. Is if you're at a minyan and they're davening earlier before three stars came out, so it's before six,
Yeah.
and they're ending davening, basically when three stars are coming out. But Aleinu, you just need a few more minutes. In that case, definitely according to everyone, say Aleinu first, Seudah after,
Right,
so you
it's
could
not
buy
safe.
more time. So you could buy more time.
All right.
It's an important point. You already knew that. I just wanted to. Yeah, we have. I just wanted to just get it out there. Yeah. All right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, have a good day. Happy Lag BaOmer, not Lag LaOmer.
No, Lag Omer.
We're Ba'ers over here. All right, we'll learn about that more also.
Lag Omer.
No one calls it Lag LaOmer.
It should.
Well, why don't they? LMI? Because it's bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, so the Rav says you count Sefira Omer and then you right after you say La Omer.
Yeah, but you got to do the whole thing again. We're going to learn about that more also, but yeah,
What do
correct.
you mean the whole thing?
We're going to learn about that more, but yeah, you have to say the whole line over. Hayom, Yom, etc. The whole line.
Yeah, I know.
We'll learn about that more though.
Before the Rachamon?
Yeah. Yes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. I haven't been doing that, but yeah.